Hello and welcome to another Night Guys Gaming video. Today I just wanted to quickly cover the dataslate changes and do a little analysis on what those changes mean for us. Take a look at the units that changed and the math behind their changes and see where we sit in the new meta. So real quickly, the changes are that Asurmen went down 10 points, so now he's only 125. The Avatar of Khaine went down 20 and he is now 280. Corsair Voidreavers went up 5 to become 65 points. The 10-man went down 10 points, so they are only 110. 5 Dire Avengers went down 5 to be 75. 10 Swooping Hawks went up 20, and they are now 190 for the 10. And lastly, 5 Wraithblades went down 10, and they are now 160 for that unit. Before I jump into the math side of the video, I did want to talk about a metric that I'm using to talk about the efficiency of units. I am using what I'm calling the return on point investment, or ROPI for short. This is going to be basically taking a look at how much we spend on our own units and how many points they cost, how much damage they do to different types of units that our opponent may bring, and then looking at that ratio between how many points we spent versus how many points of damage we did in one turn of shooting. This could also be one turn of shooting in combat or just combat. It depends, of course, on the weapons that the units have. I would not just do the shooting for the Howling Banshees, for example. I will be including their shooting and melee because in most cases they're going to be doing both. So we take a look at the ratio between the units, and that will give us a percentage that will be our return on point investment. And again, I'm just saying ROPI for short, makes it nice and easy. So for an example here on the screen, we can see that we have Guardian Defenders at 100 points, and then an opponent brings 10 Tau Breacher Team models. These are also 100 points. So we can look at those Breacher teams and see that for each wound, they're spending 10 points because each model is only one wound. We then take a look at the average damage that the Guardian Defenders do, which is 5. We multiply our 5 wounds of damage that we did by the 10 points per wound that our opponent spent on their unit, and that gives us 50 points worth of wounds of damage that we are doing to that unit. We then take those 50 points worth of wounds that we dealt and divide it by the amount that we spent on the attacking unit, which would be 100 points in this case, and that gives us our 50% return on point investment. And again, this is just within one turn of combat or shooting, and that will give us an idea of how quickly we can get the return on our investment, and it will give us a good idea of how efficient our units are into particular types of units. And this is really important because it'll give us a good idea, generally speaking, of what types of units that our units are most efficient into, or their preferred targets. So I just wanted to explain this metric real quickly before we jumped in. Feel free to pause and take a look at this example and make sure that it's easily understood. I try to make it as clear as possible. I know it's a bit of numbers back and forth here, but I think this ratio and understanding what we're getting out of our units will help us when making decisions of what types of units that we're going to be sending our units into. Let me know in the comments if you like this metric and if it makes sense, but we're going to go ahead and continue moving on to take a look at the units and the ones that have been changed by the dataslate. We are going to start with the Avatar of Khaine. He went down 6.67%. That says 20 points out of 300. And you can see here that this is his average damage that he does, and these numbers have not changed. But I wanted to put them up so you got an idea of how much damage he could do into different types of targets. You can see in this top chart here, across the top is his total damage if he shoots and charges and fights. The row below that is just the Wailing Doom, his shooting attack, and how much damage that does on average in one turn. And then below that it says melee, and the way I've set this up is that melee is going to show the best option between him using the strike or sweep profile and of his melee attacks. And so you can see over here in Guardsman, it says 8.3, and that's because we looked at the strike attack at 4.2, and the sweep attack will do 8.3 wounds on average against Guardsmen, and so it's going to select the 8.3, and then we add that to the amount of damage on average that the shooting attack is going to do into Guardsmen, and that'll give us the total of 9.3. And of course, if you look at something like the trend effects on the other side, of course, the Wailing Doom is doing 2.9. For melee, we're looking at 15.3 on average, and we're using the strike profile, of course, because it's 15.3 versus the sweep only doing 3.3. So we add the 15.3 of the strike melee profile to the shooting attack of 2.9, and that gives us an 18.1 average damage against the trend effects. So hopefully that makes sense, and all the numbers you're going to see in the charts are going to be pretty much calculated like this. The next chart is showing his damage in aspect host, and I think that if you're going to see an avatar of Khaine, it's almost always going to be an aspect host, and that's because aspect host has the most support for the avatar of Khaine. And also you can kind of see in the numbers here that his average damage goes up a respectable amount due to the reroll ones to hit, makes him more reliable, and it's a solid damage boost on a unit that does a decent amount of damage on average. So moving into his efficiency, the return on points invested, or ROPI, he is sitting kind of low, and you would expect that into most infantry. We're looking at somewhere between 18 and about 40% against most infantry. A little better into the Aeldari profile. He hits them and gets a bit of value because they actually are pretty expensive models. But where he really shines is into targets like Predators, War Dogs, Vindicators, and things like that. And you can see that against a Vindicator, he's actually got 103% return on points invested. And I just want to make a quick note so it's easy to understand what that's telling us. I want to make sure you understand that that doesn't mean that if the Avatar of Khaine runs up and shoots and then fights into a Vindicator that you immediately get all of your return on points invested because he killed a Vindicator. Quickly, just taking a look at the difference in points, we see that a Vindicator is about 90 points less than an Avatar of Khaine. So even if you run up and destroy a Vindicator, you are still going to need to make up about 90 points of value with the Avatar of Khaine to really get his full 280 points, and that's because he's so expensive. So what does that 103% tell us? It basically just tells us that he is going to overkill the Vindicator, and he's going to do so much damage into a Vindicator type target that has the same stat line with the same toughness and the same save. And he's going to do enough damage to a target like that if it is pointed similarly to where if it had enough wounds, he would actually make up his point value in just that one attack. Now, if we look at the aspect host, we can see a nice little bump in our efficiency. It's actually pretty impressive when you look at things like the Nemesis Dread Knight. We're going from 80% to 93%. That's a 13% increase in efficiency. Even the Vindicator is going up 17%. The Tran Effects is going up 13%. It's a nice, healthy jump up in efficiency when we look at the aspect host and what it does for the Avatar of Khaine. Now, if we look at the old points at the bottom row there, that's him at 300 points in most of the detachments. We can see that we have about a 5-ish% increase in efficiency across most areas. Now, the Vindicator in particular goes up 7%, but most everything else is around that 5 and 6%. You can take a look at the Tran Effects, for example. We're going from 72 up to 77 in the new point value. So we've gained around 5 to 6% efficiency across most of the targets the Avatar of Khaine wants to go into with this new point. What I found interesting is even though he went down 20 points, that only increases efficiency by 5-6%. But what increases his efficiency significantly more is actually him just being an aspect host. He's going up around 13%. And you can see that just being in the right detachment actually increases his efficiency twice as much as going down 20 points. I do think the Avatar of Khaine could probably have come down another 20 points, and that would have put him in a really nice place. It's not too bad though. He does have some pretty good efficiency into certain targets, and with his durability on top of that, he's actually priced respectably. And I don't think it's necessarily that he's a bad unit at this point, but it's going to be hard for him to break into the competitive scene because he is still a lot of points wrapped up in one unit. And for him to trade up is just very difficult. A lot of armies don't take the right types of units to where the Avatar is actually going to be trading up. And also with the prolific amount of and also with so many things like knights running around, people are gearing up to take out the big targets like Avatar. And so he will often run into a wall of anti-tank fire, which can make him a little bit harder to play. But when we actually look at the math, I can really see why they pointed him the way that he did. He's a heavy target destroyer, and his durability is respectable, so it's hard to complain about how he's pointed right now. Anytime we're looking at efficiency up in the 80+ percentages, that's very respectable and usually a really good sign that we can get good value out of the unit, even just with them running up and getting 1 turn of value. If we're using them correctly, where they're hopefully doing more than just damage, for example, maybe he's storming an objective, or he is move blocking or screening or doing a secondary for us while also destroying a unit, we can get more than just his damage value out of him. And then when the opponent goes to hit back, the opponent may have to expose a whole lot more of their army to be able to take him out, which will then let us hit back even harder on the next turn. So when you consider all the value that he could bring, I think he's actually pointed at a reasonable place. And like I said, though, it wouldn't have hurt for him to come down probably another 10-20 points, and that would have possibly put him in the more competitive tier. But it'll be interesting to see what people do with him. And let me know in the comments if he's somebody that you've been taking and if you've been enjoying him and if he's worked out good for you, because I can definitely see how he could be a good asset and bring some durability that we just generally lack in most all of our units. Okay, moving on to the unit that I was most impressed by as far as how they handled the nerf and buff on this. The 5-man unit was increased by 5 points, so the 5-man went up 8.3%. The 10-man unit, however, went down 10 points and went down 8.3%. And so there's a decent decrease on that 10-man, and it's now to the point where we have 65 points for 5 and 110 points for 10, which puts it at only a 45-point difference between going from the 5-man up to the 10-man. The other thing is, when you go to that 10-man, you get the Wraith Cannon, you get another blaster, and you get a few more power swords. So what we're going to see is that there's actually an increase in efficiency because of the extra powerful weapon that you get, the heavy weapon of the Wraith Cannon. And on top of that, with it only going up 45 points, it's much less than buying a whole nother 5-man of Voidreavers. And so you'll see here that the average damage of the 5-man is in the middle. It can take out a few things, take out a couple Marines, take out 2 Gene Stealers, take out 6 Guardsmen. Pretty average. Now that is when they're just rerolling 1s. And the second set of rows you'll see there is when the enemy is on an objective. They get a nice little boost in damage, and they can take out an extra Guardsman, possibly another Aeldari. And so it's just a small little boost of damage, but when they get full rerolls to hit, it does help and makes them feel much more reliable, especially on the blaster weapon, to make sure you have a good chance of getting that damage in. Now, when we look at the 10-man, the numbers are pretty impressive when you look at the more durable side of the chart. So when you start looking at the truck and Nemesis Dread Knight and everything to the right of that, we can see a very big difference between the 5-man and the 10-man. For most of the numbers beforehand, like Guardsmen, we go from 7.7 to 15.1, so we're basically just doubling, which makes sense because we're going from 5-man to 10-man. But when we get to things like the Nemesis Dread Knight, we're going from 2.2 up to 5.5. So it's more than double, and by a decent margin. It's basically going from 4.4 would be double up to 5.5. So it's a full damage on average more into the Nemesis Dread Knight. And while I understand that doesn't sound like a lot, when you consider that the average being 4 and then going up to 5, that's a 25% increase in damage. And so you can look at it as a greater than 25% increase against the heavy targets that this unit can do, which makes them a bit more interesting. On top of that, when you have something like a Wraith Cannon that gets full rerolls to hit when an enemy's on an objective, you have some decent reliability that we're going to do some okay damage. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the efficiency of the unit now that things have changed for both the 5-man and 10-man. Okay, so the Roppy for the 5-man looks pretty average to middling. We're looking at somewhere between 25 and up to 50% against certain targets. Definitely better against things like Guardsmen, Gene Stealers, Aeldari, and the Chosen. Has decent return on points investment, but we got to remember that we're not expecting this unit to necessarily be a big damage dealer. We're going to be using them to score objectives, to screen, to move block, and to do a lot of the things that we need a cheap sacrificial unit to do. And that's why I think the 5-man is now priced appropriately. 60 points was pretty cheap for all the things it can do. I think 65 is just fine. It's a good spot for the 5-man. It can still do a lot of things we need a unit to do with the extra OC and make sure we can contest points with it. However, when we look at the 10-man, the return on point investment actually goes up across the board, and that's because we're getting those 5 extra models for only 45 more points. So we have a very big jump in the efficiency. Now, when I look at efficiency numbers, generally speaking, when I see somewhere between a 5 and 10% increase in efficiency, that's a noticeable difference. But we can see here that a lot of things are going up way more than that. Into Alaris Terminators, for example, that's a 20% increase. And against things like Tranifexes, we're getting nearly double the efficiency. The Vindicators, a lot of those heavier targets, Predators and War Dogs, have gone up significantly, some over 25%. And so we're seeing a really big jump in efficiency when we go to that 10-man Voidreaver. When you go to looking at an enemy on an objective, we can see that the Corsair Voidreaver 10-man actually start to get up into some pretty respectable numbers. Anytime you're in that 70-80% range, that's actually a pretty good return on point investment when you consider that you're getting that return in just one of your turns between shooting and then charging and fighting. If you're able to do this while at the same time contesting an opponent on an objective, doing some screening or move blocking, it's actually a very impressive unit, all things considered. And I think it's a really neat place where the 5-man is very intriguing because we like to have something that has scout and the extra OC, while the 10-man is very, very efficient and still can provide a lot of those things for us, but it is in a bit more expensive package, but we're getting a lot of value for just that extra 45 points. So very interesting. I really like the way that they balance this. I wish they did a bit more of this kind of fine tuning, and this was a very good change in my opinion. But it actually makes the 10-man kind of interesting enough for me to where you can see that the Voidreavers are doing pretty efficient damage into a lot of targets. And I'm going to back up just for a second and take a look at the damage that we're doing into things like trucks and rhinos. And I think that there's an interesting breakpoint here where we can see that against trucks we're doing 9.7 damage on average, and against rhinos we're doing 7.8. Now that is when they are on an objective, but we have to remember that these guys also have grenades. So on average, if we move up our Corsair Voidreaver 10-man squad and we get all the shooting into the truck or rhino, there's a pretty good chance between throwing the grenades first and then doing all the attacks that we actually destroy the truck and the rhino, which then allows us to attack the things that have been inside of it. And so this could actually be a nice little cheap transport buster that will allow us to get some of these things that we generally have a hard time trading into efficiently because rhinos and trucks are so cheap. It's hard for us to destroy them with a unit that we don't really want to expose, of course, because we don't want our opponent to get to them. Teams that have a lot of rhinos and trucks and those types of transport vehicles can sometimes be a little bit difficult for us to handle because we're not getting our value into their units that are actually expensive and the ones that actually do a lot of damage. We're only destroying the transports. And when we do that, when the opponent hits back, they're able to do so much damage to us that it can cause big problems. So I think it is an interesting unit where you can throw up that 10-man. It's not that expensive. It's only 110 points. They're going to put a ton of OC on an objective. They're going to take up a big amount of space on the board. And they're still going to be able to bust up things like trucks and rhinos. So pretty interesting unit. I would love to hear what people think about it. I'm definitely going to be doing some tests with them, and we'll probably be trying them out in some lists to see how they feel as a 10-man. I don't think I'd take more than one, but who knows? We'll see how they work, and if they are doing good enough at the skirmishing side of the game, then who knows, maybe we'll be running more of those. But I'm interested to see what people think and how it plays out in the meta. And now we get to the sad part of the data slate. We're looking at Dire Avengers, and you can see this is average damage. The top row is them just shooting. The second row is them shooting while being within a sustained hits range. And if we look at the numbers, they're really pretty pitiful, and you can see why you haven't been seeing the Dire Avengers in competitive play really at all. They almost do no damage to a lot of the targets in the game, and only like 1 damage when they're in sustained hits range to the heavy targets. And even when we look at the light infantry, Gene Stealers, and Marines, the things that you would think they'd be good at taking out, this is assuming things being in cover, but we can see that they're only taking out like 1 Marine model, 2.7 damage on average for the entire squad shooting into Space Marines. And that's just pretty awful. But it makes sense when you think you're hitting on 3s, wounding on 4s, your AP1 basically goes away because they're in cover. So you're just really bouncing off of things like Space Marines, and anything that has toughness 4 or greater with a respectable save is just not really going to be taking much damage. And anything toughness 5 and greater is also just really not taking any damage. So we're not even really that good against the Orc boys. And I think this shows how Dire Avengers are just really in a bad state right now. I think they need some kind of rework, whether that is extra AP or maybe extra AP when they get within the 9-inch range. That way they get the sustained and an extra AP, which would help them quite a bit into being at least slightly more efficient into some of these units that have 3-up saves. But right now, as it stands, the Dire Avengers are just really awful for 75 points. Even though they went down these 5 points, it really didn't do anywhere near enough to justify how pretty poor that this unit does when it comes to damage. And Dire Avengers are really supposed to be a damage unit. They're not very durable. They're not overly fast. And in fact, when we compare them to another unit that cost only 10 more points, the Swooping Hawks, we can see that we're really missing out on a lot. The Swooping Hawks are twice as fast. They have deep strike. They have guns that shoot even further than the Dire Avengers. They also have lethal hits built in. And even though they don't have any AP, a lot of times the Dire Avengers are shooting at things in cover and also effectively have no AP almost. And so it really doesn't feel like the Dire Avengers have anything on the Swooping Hawks whatsoever. And in fact, the Swooping Hawks grenade ability that they have built in allows them to actually do some damage into everything in the game. They're not limited to just light infantry only, where they're only doing like 1 damage to heavier tanks. The Swooping Hawks can actually do several damage to even some of the toughest targets in the game. And for only 10 more points, it seems like you'd be crazy to take these Dire Avengers over the Hawks at any point in time. Now, I did try to help them out by looking at the numbers when they come out of a Falcon, but even that wasn't impressive at all. They're still only taking out basically 2 Space Marines, and even when they get in sustained range and they're out of a Falcon, full rerolls to wound, you're looking at on average 5 damage, so they're only taking out 2.5 Marine models on a full-on bonus that they would be getting, and it's just really pretty sad numbers. So let's take a look at their efficiency and see how they look on that end. So we can see on the efficiency side that, of course, our numbers are not looking very good. The only thing that we even have good efficiency into is Aeldari, and most things in the game have decent efficiency into Aeldari, and that's because our models are pretty expensive for their durability. Of course, being toughness 3, not necessarily having the most amazing saves, and only having 1 wound, and being pretty expensive per model makes it so that it's very easy to have good efficiency into Aeldari. So Dire Avengers are pretty good at taking out other Aeldari, but outside of that, we get 50%-ish against Guardsmen and around 50% against Gene Stealers, so we're at least somewhat capable of doing respectable efficiency damage into those units, but everything else is absolutely terrible, and in fact, most things in the game, we're barely getting out of single digits. When you look at them with sustained hits, it gets a little bit better, but the numbers are still pretty terrible. Guardsmen and Gene Stealers are now pushing up to 65%, which is okay. But when we come out of a Falcon is where we finally start getting to good numbers. We can actually get 100% of our value by shooting Gene Stealers when we get our full rerolls to wound, and we have our sustained hits. Now that's a lot to have happen, and you have to get within 9 inches to do that, so I don't think that's necessarily realistic all the time. So really we're probably looking more along the numbers along the top of this row, 70%, 95%, and 80%. And so as long as you can get the Dire Avengers into specifically the lightest of infantry basically in the game, they'll do some damage and at least make up their points, but against basically everything else, they are awful and just really not in a good spot. So I hope GW will show them some love at some point in the future, make them at least something worth considering. But right now, with the things we have in our codex, these guys unfortunately just don't do really anything. And unless you're running them with Asurmen just to help boost Asurmen, there's almost no point in taking these in any list at all, which is really sad because I love the Dire Avengers, and they were something I used off and on in the index when they had lethal hits. The lethal hits definitely made them something that actually could hit and do damage to a wide variety of targets, but now they're really pretty poor in almost every metric. So going on to the Swooping Hawks, I'm just going to look at the 10-man because that's the only one that changed. It increased almost 12%, which was our biggest nerf. So the 10-man went up 20 points, and so that's 2 points per model. And we can see here that the damage that they do is okay into most of the targets in the game. Now, it's not super amazing when we look at just the top row here. This is them just shooting, and that's shooting at 24 inches away, which is kind of nice that they have that range, but they're only doing somewhere around 2 and 3 damage to the heavier targets, and still doing respectable damage into guardsmen and Aeldari and gene stealers as well, but nothing too crazy. They're only taking out 3 Space Marines, and that's with all 10 of them shooting, so into Space Marines, they also can struggle a bit, but we would expect that with no AP and only strength 4 weapons. But when we look at what they can do when they use their Mortal Wound ability, all of a sudden we can see why the Hawks have been used so much in competitive play, because they are on average going to be doing 4.75 approximately mortal wounds for every time that they use their ability as a 10-man, and that's because it is capped at 6 mortal wounds. So normally you would think the average would be 5, but the problem is when you roll really well and you'd normally do 7, 8, or 9, or 10 mortal wounds, you just don't do that. You only can do 6, and so that brings the average down. And it's not a whole lot that it goes down. Like I said, it's around 4.75, 4.76. But what I did is went ahead and just rounded down to 4. So you can take a look at this as the damage that they do, and then doing 4 mortal wounds, which would be pretty much what you would want to be expecting when the Hawks get within range to use their Mortal Wound grenade ability. So taking that into consideration, we can see that they're doing now 5, 6, 7 damage to even some of the tankiest things in the game. And it just gives them a ton of flexibility because they can do damage to infantry, mid-level vehicles and monsters, and even very, very tough things like Tranifexes. We're still doing at least a respectable amount of damage. Now, when we look at 5-man Hawks, I wanted to kind of compare the 10-man with the 5-man because the 5-man didn't change. And you can see that the damage is going to be exactly half because even though the 5-man Hawk's average mortal wound is 2.5, in my system I have to use whole numbers, and so I rounded it down to 2. And so we're basically going to be doing almost exactly half. It's not quite, it's a little bit better than half, but that's just because the Exarch has a better weapon than the other Hawks. And since you get 1 Exarch for the 5 regular Hawks in the 5-man squad, and you still only get 1 Exarch in the 10-man squad, that means that the 5-man squad is already going to be starting off slightly more efficient because it has one of the better guns for fewer models. So when we take a look at the efficiency here, we can see that the efficiency of the Hawks is pretty low if they're not getting their mortal wounds off. It's actually pretty bad into a lot of targets. Even with their lethal hits, because they have no AP, they're looking at 17, 18, 19% into a lot of targets. Now, of course, into light infantry, they're doing a little bit better, but where they really shine is when they can get their mortal wounds off, and all of a sudden they're doing somewhere between 30 and 50% against almost everything in the game. So they have a lot of versatility and capability of doing damage to most everything in the game. When we take a look at the 5 Hawks, we can see that we're getting, on average, somewhere around a 5 and 6% increase in efficiency. Now, some of them it's even more, but that's a pretty good rule of thumb, is around a 5 to 6% increase in efficiency. And like I said, greater than 5 is where you actually start to see something that's somewhat noticeable. And so I think you will start seeing the 5-man Hawks become much more used because the 5-man Hawks are going to be more efficient. They're still going to be able to do a lot of the things that the 10-man could do, which is move blocking, screening, getting to positions, contesting objectives, and doing all those types of different things. And so the 5-man, I think, is going to be generally the most common way to go. The 10-man, unfortunately, is not always supported that well. We don't generally use a lot of stratagems on the 10-man Hawks in a lot of cases. We would rather be using those stratagems on things like Fire Dragons or Dark Reapers and things like that. And so you won't see the 10-mans being used as often because we don't really need them for efficiency with our CP as much. And so I think the 5-man Hawks is going to be generally what you're going to see. I do think there's a possibility you might see 1 10-man squad in some list, but generally speaking, I think we're going to be seeing most people go down to the 5-man. But I do think you will be seeing Swooping Hawks in most lists because they're still very good, very efficient into a wide variety of targets, and bring a lot of value with their speed and ability to get different places on the board. So very interesting changes. It's kind of what I expected, but I also actually expected them to push up the regular Hawks by about 5 points, but we'll take it that they didn't nerf the 5-man Hawks, so we can continue using them, and I think you will be seeing them in most lists. So looking at the Wraithblades, we have the swords and axes here, average damage. You can see that it is pretty mediocre. They do like to go into things like Gene Stealers and Marines, of course. It's going to be some of the more efficient targets. But against a lot of things in the game, they're really not doing much damage. As soon as you get into any kind of durability, you're looking at somewhere between 3 and 5 damage, which isn't amazing with a unit that costs 160 points. So this is the damage, and we will push forward and take a look at its efficiency. So we can see here that the efficiency of the Wraithblades is really low across the board. We are only pretty good into things like Gene Stealers and Marines and Aeldari. And like I said, Aeldari, almost everything is good into, but it's actually decent into Marines because of the 2 damage profile. So we're looking at 65% for Marines. But as soon as we drop down to the axes, things drop even more because the swords are definitely better when it comes to efficiency and damage. But if you want that extra durability by getting them a 4-up invuln, then you got to drop to the axes. And even though the axes have better strength, there's so many fewer attacks that their efficiency and damage goes down pretty significantly, sometimes around 15 and 20%. So when we look at this, we can see that the axes do take over in efficiency as soon as we start getting to the higher toughness targets, things that are like toughness 10 and better. Things like Predators, War Dogs, Vindicators, the axes are going to do better, but those really aren't prime targets for the Wraithblades in general, unless you are running them in Spirit Conclave where you can give them the dev wounds. But a lot of times we're wanting these guys to go into things like our opponent's medium infantry, things like Marines and Gene Stealers, 2-wound infantry in a lot of cases. But unfortunately, even though the Wraithblades are one of our slowest units, and their toughness was nerfed, they're not that tough anymore, really. And on top of that, they only do melee, so they don't have any shooting whatsoever. And you take all those things combined, and you take a look at these numbers, and we can see why I think Spirit Conclave's really been struggling, because their units like this are just very inefficient. Their durability does not make up for how inefficient that they are. When you see things that are melee specialists, you usually expect their damage and their efficiency damage here, their ROPI, you would expect it to be quite a bit higher. I would like to see them at around 80% into some of their favored units like Space Marines, because that at least lets us know that you're going to get a decent amount of value if you can get them into the right target. But in this case, they don't even get great value into things like the Marines and the Gene Stealers, which are their favored targets. So you're giving up speed, you're giving up good damage, and you're giving up shooting, and you're not really getting much in return. Their durability, their toughness went down, and a lot of people are running damage 3 weapons, and these guys really go down pretty easily. So I think it's pretty sad right now, the state of the Wraith units. I would love to have seen the Wraithblades get an even bigger buff, but also a lot of the other Wraith units, because Spirit Conclave has just been in a pretty bad way for the entire codex, and it's really unfortunate because I love the Wraith units, and I really do hope that they get a lot more attention in data slates moving forward. But unfortunately right now, I don't think this really is going to do anything to really make much of a difference. The 10-point decrease in cost, while a step in the right direction, is not nearly enough to actually push these units into a real competitive scene. Okay, so Asurmen, I did spend the most time on the math behind Asurmen, and that's because he has so many different situations with his ability. At the top row here, you can see him just coming out and shooting at something. His numbers are really pretty bad. His average damage is basically 1 or 2 against almost everything. His favorite target is definitely Gene Stealers, where he could actually take 2 of them out, but generally speaking, his damage is pretty pitiful. When we look at the next row, we see Asurmen with Hand, and that's the Hand of Asuren, so that's him using his once per game ability. We can see that his damage does go up, especially into things like Marines, Chosen, Possessed, Terminators, and even like the Aelaris. But unfortunately, his low AP makes it so that it's not anything too amazing into a lot of the other targets. but the dev wounds is allowing him to at least get some damage into a lot of these targets that he wasn't getting any damage into before. When you go from 0.6 damage on a predator to 2.5, it is a 4 times increase in damage, but that's just because you are probably going to get lucky enough to pop in a dev wound here and there with his shooting attack. And again, this is only once per game, so these are not amazing numbers to see on a unit when they can only get this kind of damage once per game. When we then look at Falcon, this is just him coming out of a Falcon. The numbers are still very low, a lot of times only doing 1 damage to most targets that are tougher than a Alaris Terminator. And when we look at light infantry, we're still not really doing a whole bunch of damage. I mean, on average, he's only taking out 3 guardsmen. He's only taken out 1.5 Marines on average. So his numbers are pretty low. But where it starts to finally look at least more respectable is when he comes out of a Falcon, which is that H and F is going to be the hand of Asurmen, so using his ability, and F, so coming out of a Falcon as well. So he's getting this 4 rerolls to wound. So now you're getting better chances to get your dev wounds, and his damage does increase quite a bit in that case. You can see the numbers start to actually look much better. Now, to get a full picture of what Asurmen can do, I think we need to take into account not only his shooting, but his melee. But I did want to separate him because I think a lot of times he's going to be doing some shooting in the early parts of the game. Since he can move, shoot, move, he's going to be moving, taking some pot shots, moving back to safety. But on the go turn, or on the turn where you really want to commit him, he's going to go in, shoot, charge, and fight. That's where we can see why he's pointed at the place he is, and it's because his damage is actually pretty respectable when he gets his shooting and melee in because of the devastating wounds that he does with his sword. We can see across the top here just him shooting and charging. The next row is him again using this Hand of Asurmen ability and getting that shooting off before he charges into fights. And then the Falcon is going to give him a decent boost because when he charges in melee, he is going to be getting those rerolls to wound in melee as well. And then lastly, when he comes out of a Falcon and uses his Hand of Asurmen ability, he's actually getting quite high numbers into quite a few targets. In fact, even being able to take out some things, or at least be very close to taking out things like Predators and Vindicators. So pretty respectable damage when he uses once per game ability and gets the boost from the Falcon. So taking a look at his efficiency, it's pretty much what you'd expect. The top row is basically single digits. It's very, very bad. The only way you could ever get value out of Asurmen is by shooting into Gene Stealers all 4 rounds, basically, that he most likely is surviving, and then you'd get lucky if you could shoot at just Gene Stealers for 5 rounds straight somehow. Then he would actually pay back himself in points. But of course, we're going to be using his Hand of Asurmen ability, but unfortunately, even when we look at that, his best target is, of course, going to be Terminators. And Terminators being his favorite target when he uses that ability makes complete sense because they're the perfect profile where he's going to bypass the saves with dev wounds, and he's doing 3 damage per shot at that point, which is exactly what the Terminators do not want to see. And you can see that his efficiency, or ROPI, goes up to 51% against Terminators when he uses Hand of Asurmen ability. Now, just coming out of a Falcon, his numbers are still pretty low, but when we combined him coming out of the Falcon and using his hand ability, he starts to finally get some slightly more respectable numbers. You can see that against Terminators, he's now pushing 76%. But like I said, that's just like right at the threshold of where I want to see a damage unit be, and most everything else is more around 30 to 40%. So his numbers really aren't amazing, and when you consider that it's a once per game ability where he gets this boost and these kind of damage numbers, it's not particularly amazing, and it's pretty understandable why he hasn't been seen in competitive play, especially when he was more expensive. Now that he's gone down in points, these are the new numbers. His efficiency has at least gone up somewhat, but where he really starts to shine is when we combine the shooting and melee together. We start taking a look at those numbers. When he just does his shooting and melee with no other bonuses, he's sitting somewhere around 30 up to around 60% into a lot of different targets. So still not great, but at least more respectable. When he uses his Hand of Asurmen ability, though, when he shoots and then charges and fights, if he can do that into a Terminator unit, he actually will recover his point value. And that makes sense because he's probably going to be taking out several Terminators, and with how expensive Terminators are, he is going to be getting back a lot of value there. Now, when he just comes out of a Falcon and shoots and charges and does melee, he's still doing pretty respectable damage against a lot of targets, somewhere between 60 and 80%, sometimes even reaching 90, like into the Nemesis Dread Knight. This damage is decent when you consider, though, that he has to put himself in a lot of danger to be able to shoot and then charge and then fight in melee. So it isn't necessarily too shocking that he's doing this kind of damage, especially the fact that he's an epic hero. Now, when we put it all together, we get Asurmen coming out of a Falcon using his Hand of Asurmen ability. On top of that, charging and fighting. We can see if it can do it into specifically Terminators. He actually gets a lot of value. 154% is fantastic return on point investment against things like Possessed and Alaris. We're over 100%. Against something like a Nemesis Dread Knight, we're over 100%. And even into things like Predators, War Dogs, and Vindicators, we're over 100%. And so if you can use him out of a Falcon and get his shooting and melee into a target with full rerolls to wound using his once per game ability, he can actually recover all of his point value in just that one turn. So it is something to consider that Asurmen actually can be used when everything aligns, all the stars align, you get all the buffs on him. He can actually recover his points value. But the unfortunate thing is that if we think about how inefficient Dire Avengers are, it makes it seem a little worse because he's got to make up a bit for how expensive the Dire Avengers are and how little they bring to the table when it comes to damage. So it's not all sunshine and roses here. At the very bottom, I just put what he does with ignore cover and sustained hits because he may be able to get that a lot of times and still get to safety. But as you can see, the numbers, even with ignores cover, are still really not that impressive, and he doesn't do a ton of damage into a lot of targets, still in the single digits against a lot of the tough things in the game. This slide here is just showing if Asurmen is able to get within sustained hits range, which of course is going to be within 12 inches with his shooting. And you can see that these are the average numbers here. You can pause and take a look at them, but I'm going to move on. They have just gone up a bit because of those sustained hits, but I did want to show them for people that may be interested. And again, looking at him being able to get into sustained hits range, his Roppy will have gone up some because he's getting sustained hits on his shooting. But we can see that the numbers actually start looking really nice where he's getting a nice return on his point investment when he's coming out of a Falcon, using his Hand of Asurmen ability and gets within sustained hits range. When all this comes together and then he charges and fights in melee, he's going to be doing pretty respectable amounts of damage and have a very good return on investment. Now, this again is something that you have to take in consideration for him being a part of a big package where you're also spending 75 points on Dire Avengers and 130 points on a Falcon. So you're looking at 330 points for the package, which is not really cheap. So this is the numbers of Asurmen with Dire Avengers and the average damage they do together. So feel free to pause here, but I'm going to move on to the efficiency side. And this is the Roppy of Asurmen with Dire Avengers. Now, you can see here that when we include the cost of the Dire Avengers, that brings our Roppy down quite a bit. So we can see that even when Asurmen shoots and all the Dire Avengers shoot and they charge and they fight in melee, we're still sitting at around 30 to 40 and sometimes 50% Roppy, which is not very good when you consider that this unit generally doesn't want to be running and just going into melee very much in the game. It's usually only going to be like one time that you want to shoot and then charge them in. But these numbers are not really spectacular. And so Asurmen using his once per game ability and getting this kind of damage is not really a good sign for him just fighting with Dire Avengers. Now, this doesn't include the Falcon, so we'll take a look at those numbers as well. And so the Falcon, here just the Falcon by itself, I just kind of want to show people, because I've heard some people think that the Falcon's actually pretty good at doing damage, but when you actually look at the numbers across the top there, the average damage isn't that amazing. And when you look at the Roppy or the return on point investment for the Falcon, it is also pretty poor. We're looking at somewhere between 20 and 30% against most targets. And so you're often going to be needing to shoot with the Falcon around 4 times into any kind of target to be where you're getting your points value back. Now, of course, with how up and down Bright Lances are, you can get lucky with Bright Lances and sometimes make up the point value pretty quickly. But what you should be expecting is the average, and we're looking at average numbers here. And so our average Falcon is going to take a little while before it gets its points value back. And so in one sense, you can kind of look at this as also Asurmen's damage that he does in his one big turn has got to, again, pull even more weight because we got to pull the weight of the Dire Avengers. We also got to pull the weight of the low efficiency of the Falcon as well. And so we really need to see Asurmen doing a bunch of damage when he comes out of the Falcon and does his once per game ability. So let's take a look at everything put together. So just a quick idea with Asurmen and the Avengers, you can drop them out of the Falcon and drop them out 3 inches. But because of the size of their bases, when they come back to the Falcon, they only need to be within 3 inches, not wholly within 3 inches. So you start wholly within 3 inches. When you drop out, you move them about 7 inches away. You do their shooting, and then they can move back 6 inches. And when they move back, they will all be within 3 inches of the Falcon, and they'll be able to get back in. So you have about 7 inches that they can move out on top of the 3 inches that they can be wholly within range of the Falcon. So you have some decent range to move out, take your shots, and get back in the Falcon with that combo. And so here we have Asurmen coming out of Falcon with the Dire Avengers. Shooting is the top 3 rows, and then of course shooting and melee the bottom 2 rows, and this is assuming they're able to get within sustained hits range, and I figure that's generally almost always going to be the case. If you are close enough to charge into melee, you're probably close enough to be getting sustained hits. And then when we look at the ROPI for this package, we can see that if Asurmen and the Dire Avengers come out of the Falcon, and the Falcon shoots, and the Dire Avengers shoot, and Asurmen shoots, everything together, we can see that the efficiency is pretty bad. We're looking around 20% into most targets. As soon as they get sustained hits, they're getting a 5-ish% bump. And then with sustained hits and Asurmen using his Hand of Asurien ability, we finally start getting closer to 50%, which is really where we want to be at least. And it isn't until when we include our melee there at the bottom 2 rows to be where we actually get a respectable amount of damage. Now this is Asurmen coming out of a Falcon, getting full rerolls to wound on shooting and melee, and him using his once per game ability. We can see that when we put everything together, we're looking at around 88% into things like Terminators, 86% into Nemesis Dread Knights, 84% into Doomsday Arcs, and so those are going to be some of the prime targets for this. Terminators being, of course, Alar's Terminators also being a good target, but the Nemesis Dread Knights are basically those vehicles that have good saves or invuln saves. The devastating wounds are going to help us into those, and Nemesis Dread Knights and Doomsday Arcs are pretty expensive when it comes to their durability if you have a way to get around those invuln saves, and so that's why we're seeing these decent numbers. But this is interesting because when you take a look at the ROPI of this, we'll just take a look at the bottom row numbers because this is going to be your all-in, throw everything you can at the wall and do as much damage as you can with the Falcon, the Dire Avengers, and Asurmen, using his once per game ability. We can see that he's able to get around 80% into a lot of different targets. And so what that means is we need to make up that other 20% in the other turns, which I think he can pretty comfortably do if he is popping out of the Falcon, taking some pot shots, going back in the Falcon. If you do that about twice, and on the 3rd turn, send Asurmen in, and he goes into one of these targets that he prefers, you probably are actually going to get all the value of the Falcon, the Dire Avengers, and Asurmen back out of your investment. And so we can see that it's actually not that bad of a package when you include the Falcon. And in fact, if you went back and looked through all the numbers here, what you'll find is that it's actually more efficient to go ahead and take the Falcon because of how much he boosts that one big turn of damage that Asurmen does on shooting and melee, but it has to be both. He has to get into melee as well and get his shooting off for it to really achieve that efficiency. But it's better to take him in a Falcon and go ahead and spend the points on the Falcon than it is to just run him by himself with Dire Avengers. He actually gets better efficiency and you're more likely to get your points back if you run him in a Falcon. So I just want to make sure that people understood that, and I'm not going to go into the minute details of why that is. But when you look at all the math, we can actually see that it is more efficient and you're more likely to get your points back. And I just wanted to reiterate this because I think it's an important point. You are better off taking the Falcon than you are not taking the Falcon and just running Asurmen on foot when it comes to trying to achieve your return on investment. So take that into consideration when you're making your list, and I hope that helps you if you are interested in taking Asurmen out for a spin. I will also mention that I did not put in the numbers for him in Aspect Host, and when you do look at that, he will actually achieve basically 100% return on investment into his preferred targets if you're able to get him into them on those go turns. And so make sure that you consider that. Also, in aspect host, he actually can do enough damage even in just one big go turn between shooting and melee to make up for all the points that you spent on him, the Dire Avengers, and the Falcon. So pretty cool. I think Asurmen's at least worth considering now that he's gone down on points and the Dire Avengers have gone down on points. And I don't think by any stretch you're going to see him in every single competitive list. I don't think he's anywhere near that. But at least he's now a consideration, and I think these point changes have actually made him be at least respectable, and you wouldn't be considered crazy taking him in your list. So, for final thoughts, I think Asurmen's more interesting. He definitely has value in aspect host. However, I do think Malgan-Ra and the Reapers are still a better package when it comes to what you want to put in a Falcon than Asurmen is. Now, this is specifically in Warhost and Aspect Host where the Dark Reapers can get back in the Falcon and get multiple rounds of safety, but also the rerolls to wound. That really helps boost the Dark Reapers to a point where they do a bunch of damage, especially in Aspect Host where they're rerolling ones to hit and then getting full rerolls to wound. They really consistently do a good amount of damage, and I think that's going to be much better than Asurmen and the Dire Avengers because you're often going to get so much value out of those Dark Reapers that you can get a ton of their value in just one turn, and they can sit back even further and generally stay safe and get multiple rounds of shooting off to where they're probably getting quite a bit more than their own value. Their Rapi would be very good in that case. However, in the detachments where you can't get back into a Falcon with a stratagem, such as Guardian Battle Host or Seer Council, I do think that the Asurmen with the Dire Avengers and a Falcon package is actually kind of interesting. It does give you a unit that's able to do some early skirmishing, or at least destroy some of the skirmish units that your opponent puts up on objectives, and do it in a way that's very safe and often is going to be able to keep the Dire Avengers and Asurmen from taking really any damage in the early game. And then you still have that big go turn damage that you need in like Seer Council to really take out a big portion of the board. Asurmen can really apply a bunch of damage in one turn coming out of the Falcon, and so you can still use that to your advantage as well. And so it does still play into the style of play that I think Seer Council tends to do well with, which is sitting back for a turn or so in a lot of cases and taking out some of the opponent's skirmish units, trying to take down some of their screens. And once some of their smaller units that are screening us and causing our teleport or Unshrouded Truth to not have quite as much of effect, as soon as we can get some of those down, we can have a very strong go turn, and Asurmen does kind of fit in that puzzle. So I think he's interesting for some detachments, and I will definitely be testing him out because of this point change. It makes it make just a bit more sense to use him. The Avatar of Khaine is slightly more interesting as well. If he shows up anywhere, again, I think it'll be Aspect Host, like I said. It is difficult to trade up with him, but he's at least heading in the right direction. I would love to see him come down probably 10 more points or maybe even 20, but at least 10, and that would make it even better. But even as he stands, he's at least durable enough that his points start to make some sense when you consider he can come out, get some damage done, make up a good portion of his points value, probably destroys something that's somewhere around 160 to 200 points. And that last 80 points that you're not getting back on your investment, when you consider that the opponent's going to have to put a lot of resources to take him down compared to any of our other Aeldari units, we can hopefully make our opponent expose more of their army and then hit them back even harder on the next turn to where we're trading up much better with our other units, even though we didn't necessarily trade up on the Avatar himself. So I think he definitely has a place in Aspect Host specifically and especially. But let me know in the comments if you've been using the Avatar and your experiences with them, because I think it's actually something that could make sense in certain lists and would love to be hearing about other players' experiences with them. The Corsair Voidreavers are still great. I think you'll still be seeing 5-mans. The 10-man option does give you that blaster, 3 power swords, and Wraith cannon on top. And unfortunately, though, there's not as much support for them in the detachments. And so the 5-man units being used for contesting, screening, and scoring are probably going to still be the most common way that you see them. Them being cheap at 65 points makes it easier to use them for their sacrificial jobs versus spending 110 points. But I will say that 110 points is still not that bad for 10 bodies and a whole bunch of OC and some pretty hard-hitting weapons with some rerolls. And so it's a pretty self-sufficient unit that has grenades, built-in rerolls, and I really do think that the 10-man option is something to actually consider trying out, and would love to hear if anybody else is trying them out and what their experiences have been there as well, because I do think it's a much more interesting at this point now that they've knocked off 10 points from the 10-man unit. Dire Avengers are still pretty bad. We have a better place for our points in almost all cases, especially when you just pop up to the Swooping Hawks and spend the extra 10 points for Swooping Hawks, but even into other things, I would say even into Striking Scorpions, we at least have our Infiltrate, we have Scout, we have pretty good damage into the light infantry still, and it allows us to have even more durability. And so the Dire Avengers are just really in a pretty bad spot. We can spend a little bit less and get Corsairs, we can spend a little bit more and get Swooping Hawks. I really hope that they do something to make Dire Avengers more interesting, but at this point in the game, I think you'll really only ever see them with Asurmen, and even that, Asurmen is having to carry some dead weight. So I hope that we see some love for the Dire Avengers in the future, but we'll see if that happens this edition or not. 10-man Swooping Hawks are probably not worth it as much any longer. Doesn't mean you'll never see them. I don't think you'd ever see more than one. And in general, I think most people are going to be going to the 5-mans. The thing is that most strats, again, don't really do as much for the Swooping Hawks. We generally want to spend our sustained hits on Fire Dragons and the Dark Reapers or lethal hits. Things like that we pretty much want to be using with other units, and so there's not much reason to run the 10-man Hawk because we're not trying to get a bunch of efficiency out of the CP. And taking 5 allows us to do actually more damage with the Mortal Wound ability. So if you moved 2 5-man units near an opponent's unit, they could actually do 7, 8, or 9 mortal wounds as opposed to being capped at 6. And so it's actually kind of an interesting thing where it's cheaper to take 5-mans and more efficient to take 5-mans. So I think that's really going to be the way to go. The Wraithblades are still not very point efficient at all, and they really don't make up for it in durability for their points. And so it's not great for the Wraith still, and I really hope that GW changes that and gives some focus and attention on the Wraith units. Most attachments don't have support for the Wraith units, and so it's really sad to see the state of the Wraiths. There's just not really any reason to use them when they can't use battle focus unless they're in Spirit Conclave, and our stratagems in general just don't affect them either. Like in Seer Council, we can't use really any of our stratagems on the Wraithblades and the Wraith Guard. So it's kind of a sad state. I really hope things change because I love the Wraith units. I think they look cool. I think they're a pretty neat part of the lore, and it's fun to take something that doesn't just get destroyed by basically anything in the game. They actually have at least enough durability to stand up to some of the light weapons over the opponent, whereas the infantry that we normally take does not. So I hope that changes in the future, but we'll see. But as for now, I think they're still in a pretty bad spot. As far as the meta, I think the data slate was good for us. We had fewer nerfs than in most of the other data slates, and the nerfs we received aren't terribly impactful. There's ways around them in a sense. And the buffs we got are at least helping some of the units move in the right direction. I don't think they buffed anything to the point where it's like, oh, now we got to take this in our list. But at least the Avatar of Khaine is heading the right direction. Asurmen's better price, but he's still overpriced. I think when you look at the damage he does, even when you include his melee combat, and you compare that to something like even Malgan Ra, who was considered one on the lower end of our Phoenix Lords, it's just weird how expensive Asurmen is. But there's still a lot of other units that need point decreases or reworks. The Fire Prism still just really isn't efficient and is very unreliable. The Wraith units in general just need some help. A lot of the Harlequin units like Death Jesters and the Voidreaver really could use some help. Death Jester is way too expensive. The Voidreaver is also just not very reliable. If it had some built-in rerolls or just went down a good amount in points, it would be much more interesting. And I even think the Solitaire could use just a little bit of a points decrease. Even though he does pop in and out of competitive play here and there, he's still just too expensive for what he does. And I think the only reason that people run him in competitive at all is because we no longer have the Autarch Wayleaper that has Lone Op. And so he's just one of our best Lone Op options that we have as far as characters are concerned. And so I think the Solitaire could use just a touch down in points. 5-10 points would help. And in general, that would help things like Ghost of the Webway and Spirit Conclave. I'd love to see those detachments see a bit more attention. It is hard to tell what the meta will look like exactly after this data slate. I do think there's going to be some more sharks in the tank against us. Things like Raven Guard, I really think the Raven Guard matchup is a pretty rough one. And if the player who's playing Raven Guard has some good skill, it's going to be very difficult for us to handle the tricks that they can do and the ability for them to have so many rapid ingress threats and just cause problems for us. And so I hope that we are able to find ways to deal with some of these new threats. And the way that the meta shifts here may be a little bit more hostile for Aeldari, but that doesn't mean that we're in a bad spot. I really do think Aeldari is probably still in the upper echelon of factions. I think we're still going to be doing just fine. We're going to still be able to win tournaments. We're still going to be in a good spot, but I do think we're going to be stepping down a little bit when compared to the previous data slate and section, because knights aren't going to be quite so prolific, and so our favorite targets being knights are not going to be everywhere, and so we won't be having as many easy games as we generally were having when fighting against knights. So we'll see what happens in the meta. I'm interested to see what this shakeup does, but in general, I think we're sitting in a pretty good spot. Our detachment and rules were untouched, so I was a bit surprised by that. I thought Fire and Fade and Skyborn Sanctuary may have taken a touch because of all the things that we have and do that causes people to complain. It's really the Fire Dragons popping out of a Wave Serpent and then getting back in for 1 CP. I figured they'd probably make that 2 CP just to kind of make the tax on that a bit more, kind of drain a bit of our CP economy. And I also figured they would probably then take Fire and Fade and not let units return into transports on that turn with Fire and Fade. But none of that happened, and so I think Warhost and Aspect Host are still going to be doing great, and I think they're going to be very strong going forward. I do think Seer Council is also still a very strong option, albeit much more difficult to play, generally speaking, and a bit easier to make mistakes. And so if you're wanting to play Aeldari and have the best chances of doing really well at a tournament, especially if you're a beginner player or even an intermediate player that have gotten an Aeldari, you're going to probably find better success and consistency with things like Aspect Host and even to a degree Warhost, but I think especially Aspect Host. But let me know in the comments what you've been running and what you've found to be working for you. There's definitely still a lot of power in Guardian Battle Host. I think Ghost of the Webway is still a lot of fun to play. Spirit Conclave is still fun to play, but very underwhelming when it comes to just damage in general. But I think our detachments are really neat, and with just a little bit of tweaking, I think we could be sitting in a place where there's a lot more interesting detachments to take than just what you see everywhere with Aspect Host and Warhost. So overall, it was a pretty okay balance change. I was hoping to see a bit more love for Wraith and Harlequin, but in general, I think we're still sitting as a nice, powerful faction, so there's not too much to complain about when it comes to that. And I hope to hear from you guys in the comments what your thoughts were. And if you got any value out of this video, feel free to like, share, subscribe, and do all the YouTube things. It just helps. The channel's been growing. We actually went past 1,000 subscribers, which is super exciting. So let me know and give me a little bit of feedback if you would about what's going on with the ads, because it's hard for me to exactly tell as I'm still kind of learning how their ad works on YouTube. So let me know. And if you would like to support in other ways, I do have a Patreon, which you can check out in the description below. I also have a website you can take a look at, nightgeistgaming.com. If you're interested in coaching, then you can check out that website, send me a message, and we'll connect on Discord and talk about what coaching looks like through Nightgeist Gaming. So I would love to hear feedback from you guys. I hope this video is helpful, and we will talk to you in the next one.